whenever there is more than 5 Black and brown people gathered in Philadelphia, the police come out with their horses and um, toys and guns, and they overreact. For some reason, they decided to move all the women from that facility um, and move them to the detention center, one of the worst prisons in Philadelphia, that was the subject of several lawsuits. Currently, a lawsuit too about them not improving prison conditions there. They didn't have clean water. This was in the winter when they moved them. They didn't have heat. There was like trees growing through some of the cells, like vegetation from
Oh
outside,
my
because they were
gosh.
like abandoned for a long time. They were in disuse. 9 out of 10 people held in a Philly jail are there pre-trial, so like they haven't had a day in court. According to the law, they're innocent, and so you're stuck in jail for like a month, 2 months, 6 months, 12 months, waiting for your court date. In the meantime, you've lost your house. If you have children, you've probably lost custody of them, and they're in foster care now. You've lost your job, and then by the time you do get out, because your case has been dismissed or withdrawn, or you finally get your day in court, your life is in shambles. And it's not like the system steps up to help repair the life that they've broken. um, there's no like compensation for this. There's no support for helping people get back on their feet once they've been through this process.
Candace, welcome to the show. You are the lead organizer for the Philadelphia Community Bail Fund. Founded in May 2017, your organization has bailed out 607 of your neighbors and spent over $4 million in bail. I'm eager to learn about your important work and to discuss a variety of topics from cash bail and abolition to defunding the police. But before we dive into the heart of our discussion, I'd love to know your superhero origin story. What moment or series of moments influenced your journey to become a lead organizer?
Yeah, I think it's sort of a long, complicated story, but I'm gonna try to keep it brief. I was raised by a Pentecostal preacher's son, so like Christian, evangelical Pentecostal, and the one thing I really grabbed onto from that faith upbringing was the need to work for justice. That's like a recurring theme in the Bible, in Jesus' life and work. Standing up for justice, whether it's like whipping people who are selling and swindling people of their money in the temple courts. Jesus has a long record of like having choice words for rich people, standing up for justice. So when I was little, I always wanted to um, have my life be meaningful in that way, that I was working for justice somehow. I didn't know what that meant yet.
Mm-hmm.
It was very nebulous. So when I moved to Philly in 2008 after law school, I went to law school because I didn't know, oh, that's something that will respect my immigrant parents' wishes. And it's something that will give me a background needed to do justice work, not being killed 2 birds with one stone. But that lasted all of a hot second, thanks to the market crash with the mortgage-backed securities that happened in 2008.
Mm-hmm.
When I fresh out of school with all this loan debt, and so I was working in like local peace movements. Working against there was a drone base in Horsham, PA, not too far outside of Philadelphia, where there were actually people who were piloting drones from that base or bombing brown people, on the other side of the world.
Mm-hmm.
And so we would do like protests outside of the drone base downtown to let people know what's happening. And I was part of this intentional Christian community that was based around peacemaking called Shalom House. And that was mostly focused on like the gun violence issue in Philadelphia and the drone warfare. But I started reading this book called by Michelle Alexander called the Nuclear Jim Crow, basically. And reading that, I really found it very, very powerful, and it helped focus a lot of my attentions because she talks about, just the issue of mass incarceration and how it's a cycle that keeps like putting a vast majority of like Black and brown men in this country having some type of connections with the system at some point in their lives. something like 2/3, of Black men. And I noticed when I was like going to work on the subway, hearing conversations about people talking about being back in prison, or having to go um, see their PO. And, I just started noticing more that this was happening around me. And I figured, the peace issue is a big one and affects all people, but this is something that was like shining in my face that impacting so many of my people and my neighbors, and there has to be something I can do about it. So I really didn't know how I would get involved because mass incarceration is such a humongous system, and it has so many different pillars and spindles. I cannot speak English today. I apologize
No
for
worries.
my bumbling, but it has so many tentacles,
Mm-hmm.
basically. That is really hard to try to kill the entire beast. So I didn't know where to begin.
Mm-hmm.
So I was working with this group called Up Against the Law Legal Collective that was doing training for people to know their rights when interacting with police, helping to do legal observation at protests, and so educating the community about, what to do when you're harassed by the police, how not to answer questions when the police stop you, just basic things like that. And so since I was in that group, I was be on call when there was protests happening. And at that time, I remember there was a protest that was happening at City Hall. It was the reading of the grand jury verdict and it's really sad. I should know his name off the top of my head, but there's been so many Black men that have been murdered by police in just the past 5 years
Mm-hmm.
that they blur. And I know his name, and I really feel awful, but it was the man who was killed in New York City. He had been accused of selling some cigarettes, without a license.
Eric Garner?
Eric Gardner, and
Mm-hmm.
it was the reading of the jury verdict, the grand jury verdict.
Mm-hmm.
And people gathered at downtown at City Hall, and so I was basically there because I knew I didn't expect a good outcome,
Yeah.
so I wasn't surprised by that, but I wanted to be there because I knew that would transform into a protest. And of course, the police, whenever there is more than 5 Black and brown people gathered in Philadelphia, the police come out with their horses and toys and guns, and they overreact. So I was there for that, and that sort of transformed into this huge protest where people marched throughout the city until the wee hours in the morning. And then it formed Philly Standing Up for Real Justice, Philly for Real Justice, this organization about racial, economic, and legal justice. Doing town halls every week where hundreds of people would attend in West Philly. And it was the beginning of the movement for Black Lives in Philadelphia,
Mm-hmm.
And so I got involved in that group. For a time, I served on the steering committee for that. Then Black Lives Matter Philly formed, and I was a part of that, also on the steering committee. And then, 2017, that's when some people answered the call from Mary Hooks. He has an organization she works with called Southern is on New Ground out of Atlanta, Georgia. And she had a call put out for people to raise money to bail out Black mamas in time for Mother's Day. And so Philadelphia got together with 1 week to go, and people reached out to Black Lives Matter because they wanted it to be a Black-led and centered movement,
Mm-hmm.
and they wanted us to be involved. And so I said, sure, I'll come out and help raise money. And we raised about $50,000 in 1 week.
Wow.
And so we really didn't know how cash bail worked. We didn't even know that you can't withdraw more than $2,000 cash from the bank at one time. So we had people who are running all around the city, withdrawing $2,000 here and there from different banks.
Wow.
And they were supposed to bail that day. And we were only able to post about $20,000 in bail that day to free 13 women. But then we still had $40,000 left, and people were still sending us money. So we were we're all from groups Black Lives Matter Philly and Youth Art Self-Empowerment Project, all these different groups around the city who are working on this issue of racial and economic justice, basically, and of course, all touching on mass incarceration. And we decided that, hey, let's stick together so we can make sure this money is spent down, and let's make this a year-round thing for all Philadelphians. And so the bail fund was born, and so I've been with them ever since. Now as a lead organizer for many years, just as like a volunteer on the core organizing committee.
Wow. So this is just really long journey. It said that it started off with, your sort of commitment to helping these different communities, and then sort of within these last 10 years, as these movements have grown, you sort of grown with that. And going into your work at the Philadelphia Community Bail Fund, you've seen and heard of all the different horrible living conditions in these jails. But now that we're in a pandemic, these conditions have gotten even more complicated. What can you tell us about the way that jails have responded to COVID, and what are these current living conditions like?
Yeah, and so Philadelphia, like many cities, had a really slow response to COVID-19 because when it first, came into real public consciousness, we were really concerned that we knew this is going to be really bad news for our loved ones who are behind bars, because we knew that they're already in living conditions where they're overcrowded, people can't socially distance. One of the largest jails in Philadelphia is like dormitory style, so people are in bunk beds in like large rooms. There really is no space to be apart. Everyone's living on top of one another. And we know that Philadelphia, as one of the poorest large cities in the country, also has years of suffering from environmental racism. So most of the people in jail are Black and brown. Most of the Black and brown people in Philadelphia have asthma. So we're like a respiratory disease that spreads from close contact with one another is not going to be good news for us. So we started pushing the DA, the mayor, the judges, and the First Judicial District to do all they could to respond. So to review cases, to like make sure you can let out as many people as possible who, one, are just there on cash bail, who might only have like 6 months left in their sentence, who are medically vulnerable or elderly, and so we had car caravans where people were coming out, hundreds of people in their cars circling City Hall while the mayor is giving his COVID press briefings every Tuesday. And so we're out there making noise, like making coffins when the first person died from COVID, and literally chasing a judge who's responsible for keeping them inside from the courthouse to her car, letting her know that, this woman's blood is on your hands because you guys have not responded to do what you can to let these people free. Like the first Black woman who died of COVID, the first person that died from COVID in the jails in Philly, she was medically vulnerable, only had a few months left to her sentence, had put in petitions to be let go, because of her medical condition, because she was so close to the end of her sentence, and it was denied. So their response was really slow, and it was to get out some makeshift mask, made from old bed sheets and whatnot.
Wow.
It was, for some reason, the women used to have their own prison called the Riverside Correctional Facility, one of the most modern of the jails in Philadelphia. One of the only jail that had air conditioning, for instance. It was built in the early 2000s. For some reason, they decided to move all the women from that facility and move them to the detention center, one of the worst prisons in Philadelphia, that was the subject of several lawsuits. Currently a lawsuit too about them not improving prison conditions there. They moved women there. They moved women to one of the old abandoned jails that basically people thought had been condemned. They opened that jail back up, which is basically a bunch of trailers, and were putting women there in these horrible conditions where they didn't have clean water. This was in the winter when they moved them. They didn't have heat. There was trees growing through some of the cells, vegetation from outside, because they were abandoned for a long time. They were in disuse. um, vermin infestations, cockroaches, and then also you've seen, these jail conditions that people are all living in are getting much worse. And so it's been sort of a slow moving tragedy because we've been raising the alarm since March 2020 that something had to be done. And they had like a really brief moment early in the pandemic where the Philadelphia police decided to stop arresting people. Well, jailing people that they arrested. They would just give them a citation, so they could come back for a court date or pay a fine. They wouldn't go to jail or be held. And when they did that policy, the jail population in Philly dropped dramatically because most people who are in jail in Philadelphia are there awaiting trial. Um, there are very few people who have short sentences that are serving less than 2 years, but most people are pretrial. So without new people coming in, the jail population dropped dramatically, which we thought was a great thing. Then the DA and the judges started reviewing some cases to see who they could let go. But, they only let go like a couple hundred people. And the Philadelphia jail population, like right now, is above 4,000 people. So it's higher than it was pre-COVID right
Wow.
now. And so, and as we know, we've heard for people who are inside, for people who have recently gotten out that we were able to post bail for that the jail conditions are only getting worse. And that the overcrowding still remains an issue. People aren't getting cleaning supplies. They're not getting new masks. Um, they're no longer getting hot food because a lot of people who are on staff, they're not coming in. So, people getting not getting hot food because, they don't have the staff there to like make it or send it in. Not like the food was good anyway. People aren't getting any time outside of their cells. So like they might get 15 to 30 minutes like every couple of days, and then just really use that time to shower, to call your lawyer, to call your loved ones. So many people haven't been in touch with their loved ones on the outside. Like one thing when people call us for bail support, we try to talk to a loved one, and one of the things we ask them is, when is the last time that you spoke to them? And like, many people that we bailed out this fall was just like, I haven't been able to keep in touch with him at all. I haven't heard from him at all. So it's been a real problem where people are basically in lockdown, and they've been in lockdown for basically the last like almost 2 years now. So it really is like a horrible problem, especially for people who are um, sick or elderly. And we've bailed out, now we've bailed out 737 people um, so far. And one of the people that we bailed out last, he was a 75-year-old man. He has kidney failure. He was in hospital because he caught an infection from dialysis, and he was held on a $250,000. This like wheelchair bound man who's been in and out of the hospital. We've had people there who were held on $30. They didn't have $30 in their name to get out, and they had been there for like 6 months before like someone heard about the bail fund
Oh my
and
gosh.
contacted us. So we've we've posted as little as $30 to get someone out, and for one woman as much as $100,000. And this is during COVID to get them out of jail. So it's a real problem in Philadelphia, and a lot of the people that who we see who like find out about us like have a lot of like medical conditions. They're like parents, mothers, sometimes they're pregnant women. There's been many pregnant women we've bailed out. So it's not to say that it's unjust just because they're vulnerable people, but like there's vulnerable people who are locked up, and there are people who like before they went in they were healthy, but once you're in jail in that conditions, not getting adequate food, the facilities aren't clean. Right now, what we're seeing is that they're really the jails are violent places because they don't have many correctional officers that are on board. You have a lot of uh, prisons that we're hearing that certain blocks don't have any staff sometimes. So like people are locked in all day, and there's been a lot of interpersonal violence between the inmates. And so several people in the last couple of months have died due to violence in Philadelphia jails, just because there's been this like lack of staff, there's been this lack of oversight, there's been people injured in the cell. People have been crying out for medical help, and no one will come to the person until it's too late. So it's been a really awful in Philly. There's been many lawsuits, protests. There was a protest this Thursday about what's happening down there. And unfortunately, while the people are waking up and hearing what we're saying and they're concerned, and a lot of people have been donating to us, and so that's not been a problem. The problem has been that the mayor, the district attorney, the judges who are in charge of the first judicial district, they just don't seem to care about people who are locked up. It's like they cease to be human to them. And they don't understand the extra justice in that, 9 out of 10 people held in a Philly jail are there pre-trial. So like they haven't had a day in court. According to the law, they're innocent. So it's sort of like you are accused of something, the police arrest you. You can't afford to pay the $5,000 to get out. That's the most common bail amount that we have to pay. And so you're stuck in jail for like a month, 2 months, 6 months, 12 months, waiting for your court date. In the meantime, you've lost your house. If you have children, you've probably lost custody of them, and they're in foster care now. You've lost your job, and then, by the time you do get out, because your case has been dismissed or withdrawn, or you finally get your day in court, your life is in shambles. And it's not like, the system steps up to help, repair the lives that they've broken. There's no like compensation for this. There's no support for helping people get back on their feet once they've been through this process. And so it's, especially in a city with such a high poverty rate, this is something that perpetuates poverty. It puts people in poverty. Like a lot of people who are just on the margins, something like this will drop you back down into a hole you can't get out of. I know I talked a lot on that one question, but it's, we have seen an increase in need during COVID, not a decrease, just because the system has not responded in any way to sort of alleviate what's happening or to decrease the number of people who are incarcerated. Their answer has been a little bit of like mask and cleaning supplies that they're giving out and vaccines. So now that the vaccine is out, people have access to them, which is good. But what we see is a lot of people who are in prison don't trust, not so much the vaccine, but they don't trust the prison officials giving them the vaccine, because it's just a system that already has a history of being woefully inadequate, like just incapable of treating their most basic medical need. And so, I'm not going to trust them to give me this injection, so it's, I wouldn't say that even now that we have the vaccines, things have improved much. They've been testing people for COVID, but again, what would be a proper response would be to free people, to let people go, especially since the vast majority of people who are in jail in Philadelphia don't need to be in jail for anyone's safety or for them to return to court. There's other things that we can do to ensure people return to court, since that's supposed to be the reason why people have bail, because bail is supposed to be a surety that a person will return to court for all their court days. But in Philadelphia, it just acts as a way to incarcerate people pre-trial, because so many people can't afford the bails that they are given, so they end up just waiting.
And I'm glad that you sort of talked about this issue from the systemic point of view, because I actually wanted to zoom out at the sort of big picture issues that you're advocating for at the Philly Community Bail Fund, because your organization's main focus is to end pretrial detention and cash bail. For folks who are unaware, why does pretrial detention and cash bail still exist and perpetuate? And how is your organization fighting to put an end to this?
Yeah. So, cash bail, like I said before, it doesn't have to be cash, but bail is supposed to be just a bond that you pay to say that I'm going to come back to court for my court date. So it could be money, it could be property. In many places, it's a sign-on bail, so you just sign a paper saying that you'll come back. And if you don't come back to jail, you might owe this fine, but you don't actually have to pay anything. So it's all supposed to be a mechanism to see that you come back to court. And then, especially in Pennsylvania, there's something in the rules of criminal procedure where if they think that you are such a flight risk or that you pose a specific danger to a person or community, they can petition to have a hearing about whether or not they will detain you. So it's supposed to be a higher threshold that they have to prove that you are a danger, and that basically detention is the only option they have to keep people safe. They don't really use that option. We've met with D.A. Krasner, who's the district attorney in Philadelphia, and they're aware that that mechanism exists, and they just give excuses why they don't. They claim there's no actual way to have these hearings, so that their hands are tied. All they can do is just give people high cash mails, hoping they can't pay to get out. So like that's the issue of cash bail, and like why it's a big problem is because, again, it disproportionately impacts people who are low to moderate income. And I'll say moderate income a lot of times because I get about $60,000 a year, is my income. I don't have $5,000 in savings to pay for a bail to get out of jail. I wouldn't be able to afford that. I've got student loans. And I have to pay for housing and things like that. I don't have that money sitting around. Most people don't have that in savings sitting around. And so it's something that it disproportionately impacts people who are moderate income, low income. In Philadelphia especially, it disproportionately impacts Black and brown people. The vast majority of people that we bail are Black. I can remember over the life of being in the bail fund, maybe 20 people who are white that we bailed out. And so, it's a system that sort of perpetuates this problem of poverty, of getting Black and brown people into the system under court supervision, because many people, even some people that we've been trying to bail out, they end up doing things where they accept a plea deal, which is a promise that they can, basically they're like, oh, if I say I did this and done this paper, I'll be able to get out of jail and be able to be with my children. And some people do this, not realizing that now you are, in some cases you can be considered a felon, and you have this brand on you for life where it impacts your ability to get housing, to get educational loans, to get jobs in some places, and you have this on your record for life for something that you probably didn't do because you really want to get out of jail, and you had been sitting in jail for a year already without any hope of getting out. And so it's something that sort of just works into these bigger picture problems that we see, and just exacerbating poverty and the way that Black and brown people are under state surveillance. And so one thing that we do to sort of work against this, why it still exists in Philadelphia, is because, in Philadelphia, we've been advocating and working with the D.A. Krasner. When he came into office, he had this big promise that he was going to end cash bail. And we used to meet with his office regularly about, the progress and getting to the point where we can end cash bail in Philadelphia. But, one of the first things he said to us is that he doesn't have the power to end cash bail. In Philadelphia, unlike other cities, it's something that has to be on the state level, because it's, cash bail is something that, the PA legislature put in place. We can't be DC, they ended it on their own. It has to be statewide, New Jersey, they have different places where they ended this. And so, what we're pushing for in Philadelphia is it to be basically abolished in practice, because of something that, the DA can choose not to ask for bail. Bail doesn't have to be set. They can recommend to, in Philadelphia is where bail is set by bail magistrates, who are appointed people who aren't lawyers, don't have to have a legal background. They're appointed to decide people's bail. And so someone's arrested, they come, they have a video conference from the jail with this bail magistrate. The whole hearing might last a minute or two, where they're asked some very basic questions that might get into what their economics are like how poor are they, if they need a public defender, and then the bail is set. And so we've heard from a lot of people that, one, this is really quick. It's over a video conferencing, so a lot of times people can't hear what's going on. The person can't really ask any questions or speak much. There might be someone from the public defenders there observing, but they can't really advocate for the person, because they don't know anything about their case or that person themselves. And then, this number is shouted at you, that you have to pay. You have a bail of $50,000, so that means you have to pay $5,000 to get out. And so, that's basically how it works in Philadelphia. And so a lot of times in those hearings, it's like the district attorney's office, they're the ones that recommend like a bail amount. So, the district attorney could, decline to actually ask for bail, And so one of the first reforms that Krasner did do was that he said, I'm going to have a list of 25 low-level offenses, and I'll instruct all my attorneys in our office not to ask for bail in these cases. And so they did, but it was for things like prostitution, people who are possessing like small amounts of marijuana, things like that. It was also like the 25 cases were things for which none of the people that we bail out or who request our help actually have those charges. So it wasn't really like making that big of a difference, because a lot of those people weren't really getting high bails or held on bail anyway. But, that's where they stopped on bail reform, something that really didn't have much of an impact. And so we're trying to press for like more real reform. And so a lot of what we've been doing lately has been educating people about what's really happening with bail in Philadelphia, because D.A. Krasner, he's supposed to be a progressive attorney. He has this policy where they ask for $1 less than $1 million bail for people, meaning that most people have to pay $100,000 to get out. And so he says that, like, for somebody, he says that he's doing this to get to a no bail system, which doesn't really make sense to me. I'm just like, make it make sense. Like, how are you ending cash bail by asking for $1 million in bail? So one, that doesn't make sense. But then his next point is that, like, he's only going to ask for that in like the most egregious cases, where people are like, it's like a very violent crime, or, this only in limited amount of cases. But like, our sister bail fund, Philadelphia Bail Fund, did a study where they've been asking for $1 million bails across the board on a wide range of cases for a wide range of people. And the only reason that we don't see a ton of people held on $1 million bails is because the bail magistrates decide that they're not going to do that. So they take the recommendation and they go much lower oftentimes. But they still are unaffordable bails. It's just not $1 million, So in Philly, like, we're stuck in this thing where everyone's pointing fingers at other actors saying, like, I don't have the power to end this. It's really the judges that have the power. Oh, we don't have the power. It's really the legislature that has the power. But like, all these actors do have power to sort of end the use of cash bail in Philadelphia. So, it can exist in the books, but we don't have to use it. You can choose not to do this. But I mean, it doesn't look good not to do this, because, in a lot of cities now, like, we have this, at least in the media, just like increase in gun violence. And so people are like more wary now to like end things like cash bail or to like release people, because we have this narrative now that, like, oh, all these kids are so violent, we need to lock up people who are violent in order to be safe. And so what we see in Philadelphia is they're doing this dance to like try to seem like we're actually trying to progress and move forward in this way, but also show that we're tough on crime. And it sort of just means that people get stuck in this limbo where there's all these promises being made, but there's no real action happening to make that a reality.
And you had mentioned this idea of these sort of failed attempts at progress, and I actually kind of want to talk about something known as the Progressive Prosecutor movement, which is a movement to end mass incarceration and create a more fair legal system. But from your perspective, you see this progressive movement as a failure. So I'm curious to know how so. Like, do you feel like it was something that was flawed from the start, or did this, how did this seemingly good idea, turn upside down?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it was probably something I think that was flawed from the start, but a lot of us, especially in leftist and progressive circles, couldn't see it because, like, I remember I was really excited when Larry Krasner was running for DA. And, we had, and especially in Philly, this, like, string of, like, DAs who were, like, really awful, either corrupt or just, like, vengeful, bloodthirsty, like, we really needed a change. And so Krasner had this, like, years-long history of, like, advocating for, like, civil rights, being a defense attorney. A lot of people in, like, the movement for Black Lives and activist circles had been defended by Krasner in his office. And so we really saw him as an ally who would sort of keep his word to put all these reforms in place. And I think that was something that was similar in other cities where they had progressive prosecutors who were, like, put into office, and that, they did have a background that made us think that, okay, they will put these policies in place. And so why I think it was flawed from the start is because it's not really an abolitionist move. And, like, I'm not convinced now that you have to come from this at an abolitionist angle, meaning that your goal is to, like, end, like, mass incarceration. Your goal actually is to, like, take away power from the police, take away power from the DA, take away power from these systems until these systems are dismantled, and you can build something up different to, not to replace it with, but to have an alternative model that you're building. And so your goal has to be to tear down these things while you're building up community structures that will keep us safe. And so, like, in Philadelphia, despite our calls to defund the police and, like, people posturing that they were listening to us, they said that they were going to, like, decrease the police budget by $40 million. And then, like, we heard that they actually just played a shell game and put that $15 million under, like, the managing director's office, but it was still being used to fund police activities. So we're like, that's not defunding. That's just, like, changing labels around in your budget, know. And so, so we wanted things like, in Philadelphia, we have a huge problem with, like, affordable housing and, like, homelessness, and especially in COVID, that's just been, that need for housing has just been so present. And, we've had, like, encampments in Philadelphia in the past couple of years that has gotten, at least locally, a lot of, like, media coverage. To say this is a problem, people taking over abandoned houses and living in them, to show that, like, we have housing stock in Philly that people are just sitting on, why not give it to people who need it? So we're like, invest in things like housing, because, like, we had people who that we bailed out who were, like, arrested for, like, basically being homeless or basically being poor. So we're like, well, give people housing, give people mental health treatment, give people, like, drug treatment, and, like, make safe, like, consumption sites a reality. There's different things that we can invest in instead of, like, the police and the DA. And I think the progressive prosecuting movement saw this thing like, oh, we can fix this problem maybe without dismantling the DA's office. We could just put good people in there and things will change. It's sort of like the thing that we've seen with, like, Black and brown people for years, like, oh, once one of us is in office, things are going to be great, so, like, oh, Obama, he's a Black man, oh, he's going to be great now. It's like, no, he's just a Black man in the same system, and he's going to be doing the same things, and he did do the same things. He was still bombing people all over the world. Like, there was no change really to, like, these systems that we see. There's no really betterment that happened for, like, Black and brown people. It's just that now we have Black and brown people in office. But I think the progressive prosecuting movement is the same thing. It's just that you're just sliding good people into the same offices that have the same power, that have the same laws, that have the same, police unions, and, all those things are still in place. And so I would like to say, like, even if they go in with good intentions, they're not going to be able to get good results because they're just using the same tools that were there before. Like, we have to have, like, a whole different, like, toolbox, we have to get rid of that system. And, like, so, like, I think, like, I don't think it's a total loss, like, I'd say in Philadelphia, Quesner has been doing good things about like keeping police accountable, and like prosecuting like dirty cops, doing things like reviewing people's cases who have been convicted of like murder and things like that, but who were wrongly convicted, and exonerating people. Like those are positive, good things, but they're not things that are going to like fundamentally take power away from the system or change things in the ground. They're things that will like very well go away when someone else is in office. They're not like lasting change that we need.
Hmm.
And so I think that's why the whole progressive prosecuting is like a boondoggle. It looks nice and great, but it's not really going to give us this, systemic change that we really want to see. Like we don't want to just see like some short-term policy changes. We want to see like, at least I want to see the whole system torn down and something that really serves us, built up instead.
I'm really glad that you brought up that sort of leftist perspective of there is a limitation to representation. It can be the answer that we have the same system, but we just put on diverse faces and we think that everything's going to be different. And sort of continuing on that same idea of widespread systemic change, I wanted to go ahead and discuss probably one of the most potentially impactful ideas, which is something you had mentioned earlier, which is prison abolition. For so many people, they can't fathom a world where prisons are abolished because we've completely normalized them as just this regular part of society that might be the reality of our history, but that doesn't have to be the future of our country. That doesn't have to be the future of our destiny. And as somebody who has an inside look at this system from a high level understanding, what's your take on prison abolition? And have you identified any paths that might be most likely towards getting us to that stage of abolition?
Yeah. So like, yeah, I personally believe that like, excuse me, abolish prisons has to be like your end goal, but it's also something I feel in a certain way I don't expect to see like in my life, or if I have children and grandchildren, even their lives, just because, like you say, it is something that's so fundamentally different from the core of like how we operate. And for many people, you can't imagine like something different existing from what you've seen. So like
Mm-hmm.
we've, had this conversation with people that we have bailed out and their family members. We have our community calls, and
Mm-hmm.
I remember one meeting I was leaving, and the icebreaker, which now I think was not a really great icebreaker question, was like basically was asking them to imagine a world without prisons. Like, what would you like to see instead? And for
Mm-hmm.
many people, or I think there wasn't even without prisons, it was without police. So like
Mm.
even a smaller chunk of that, and for them it was just like one person was really honest and it's like, what? I can't imagine that. Like, don't we need them? It's sort of like can't imagine like anything um existing that would like be able to protect us if police weren't there or if prisons weren't there. Like what, or people always say, what will happen when, someone's murdered, like if you don't have prisons and things like that. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think one of the things about like abolition and the call for like abolishing prisons and like the police is that you sort of have to also go from the angle of like of building up new things as well, and like it might be baby steps. So like one thing was like taking a small step of abolishing police, a smaller step than that. It's just sort of like, I know in Philadelphia there's been this movement now to like remove police from mental health emergency calls. And so like, when you call 911, the police will come in no matter what it is. And oftentimes you see when the police show up, things very well might go left just because like, we can get to that, the nature of the training and, how they, when you have a hammer, everything is a nail, and,
Mm-hmm.
and so like they're going to treat all these cases similarly. And so in Philadelphia, there's been this call to like, we want to have like first responders who are separate from the police who get sent out to like respond to mental health emergencies, and we want these people to be like, mental health workers who are completely separate from police. And so in Philadelphia, it's been a problem because there's been legislation written around that but they've like slid police in there, so it's like a co-responder model because we can't imagine this happening. But like imagine like we try to tell people, imagine like you call 911 because like your brother is having a mental health crisis, and they put you through to like a mental health specialist, and they come to your house, and they help respond to your brother and his needs, like without guns, like without like tasers, without violence. Like what would that look like? And like even just that small change is something that one is like easy for people to conceptualize, to be like yes, this is a good thing, this could work. And so you just build from that to like, thinking about what are like some different community safety models that we could do that don't involve the police. And so, I don't see that in Philly yet as much, but you've seen other cities like Chicago where they're trying to do just like more like violence disruptors in the community, having community people who are called in when things go down instead of police. And I think with prisons, and so it has to be like the same thing in a sense. Just thinking that about like, well, what is the goal of like prisons? At one point in this country, prisons were supposed to be about reform. Like in Philadelphia, there's like Eastern State Penitentiary, which was at the time when it was built, this model for like what penitentiary is supposed to be. It's supposed to be about penitence, and so you would put people in these little cells by themselves, and they could think about what they did, and they come out and that's supposed to reform them. At the time, that was supposed to be like progressive and revolutionary, but we realize that now that's basically torture. And that it's not about penitence or charity people, it's basically revenge and punishment. So it's sort of like, I think part of it is like getting people to like switch from this value of like revenge, or like even this penitence that we get from this Judeo-Christian sense of like how we respond to like sins, interpersonal communal sins, and thinking more about like, okay, what about like restoration? Like, can there be some like reconciliation? Can there be some accountability? How do we get to that? That doesn't involve like putting a person in a cage and forgetting about them because, oh, they have revoked their right to be considered human because they've done like this sin against a person or the community. And so, yeah, I think it sort of has to be, people have to start thinking of it, just like thinking about our values, and just how to respond to like conflict and like sins, in order for us to get to the part where we can actually get rid of prisons, because I think it's so deeply ingrained in just like, especially if you have a Judeo-Christian background, like our religion, like in this country, everything is everything is about retribution, revenge, like punishment. Like even, I had like this conflict with like my sister-in-law, and I'm just like, oh, I want to get back at them, and I'm like, why am I thinking about like revenge? Like it's not like he has to feel my anger. It's like, why is that like necessary here? Like, what about like the healing? What's going to get us to like a reconciliation or like accountability? Like letting them know like, okay, why was this hurtful for me? How can we move past this? And that's a lot harder to do than just like cursing someone out and like maybe getting in a fight. It's a lot harder to have those like conversations where you're vulnerable, you might apologize, you're hearing from someone else's perspective that has hurt you, and getting to some like healing where like you're not going to be like compensated with a person's pound of flesh. I just think that's really, counter to the ways a lot of us have been brought up.
Wow. And I appreciate you mentioning that, how defunding the police really is sort of a microcosm, but within the same fight towards prison abolition, because really it's about the challenge of challenging people to just even conceptualize like, what does safety look like in a non-police setting? What does rehabilitation look like in a prison scenario? And I think it's just because it's so ingrained. Also, you had mentioned that there's this connection to revenge and these Judeo-Christian values. I think that's so super important too, because that really does like impact and sort of position how we go about dealing with people in these situations. But my last question of the day is actually related to that idea of that vision, and sort of the future that you wish to see for you and your neighbors in Philly. So if prisons were, successfully abolished and police departments were defunded, and it didn't take your great-grandchildren's generation to be able to see these things, and millions of dollars were able to be redistributed throughout Philadelphia, what improvements would you like to see in your community and neighborhood?
Yeah, I'm just thinking about my neighborhood. I live in like West Philadelphia, in a neighborhood where there is a lot of gun violence. And so when my mom watched Philadelphia news, she always gets scared because she's like, "Isn't that less than a mile from your house?" And it's like, "Yes, Mama, it is." So like for me, what do I mean? Well, probably really some physical changes in my neighborhood. It's like my neighborhood is like very resource poor. There's a lot of like abandoned housing now, which is being bought up by developers and flipped to overpriced rental housing.
Mm-hmm.
So like one thing I would see is like I wouldn't see like these abandoned like boarded up houses, and I wouldn't see this sort of like hastily renovated like houses being like flipped, or rented out like at an exorbitant price. I think it would be like everyone will be housed and have adequate housing with updated systems. Like there wouldn't be so much trash everywhere. The local schools that are around me wouldn't look like miniature prisons, with like small or like indistinct windows. We would have, instead of abandoned lots filled with trash, like more community gardens, like especially community gardens that are like, food gardens where people can actually get fed, and like it's not just flowers and things like that. It would be those physical things. I wouldn't see as many police cars like circling and just parked in the middle of the road. Yeah, that would look really different. There wouldn't be like police. Probably wouldn't see a lot of like people who are homeless because everyone would have housing. It wouldn't matter, like, and if you couldn't pay for it, there's still housing for you. That's not crappy. I think I would see more services in my community. We're very, like, a lot of neighborhoods who are over police are also, like, very, like, resource poor, so, like, we don't have, like, good, like, grocery stores and, like, nice shops. We don't have a coffee shop, which I'm addicted to caffeine, and I have to go far, just like basic like amenities, like everyone had access to, and like my neighbors wouldn't be worried about being priced out because, a coffee shop is opening like a half mile away, or because we see a few new white people playing at the playground with their kids. There wouldn't be this like fear that, oh, that means gentrification has reached us.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think that would mean just a lot of different things for like a quality of life, because we'd be investing in those things instead of like police.
Yeah.
Which is like in Philadelphia, that's like the largest like expenditure in their budget. Like we're not just looking at salaries and things like that, because it's just like it's the police. Like we spend so much money on the police to be such a poor city. They have so many people who are houseless. They have such a bad rates of like addiction and everything, but we spend all this money on the police. And so yeah, I think that would mean that we would actually have the resources that we need in our community, for it to be safer and just, a safer place to live.
I'm glad that you mentioned all that, because I think that really strikes to the core of why a lot of communities experience these problems. It's basic things like not having enough affordable housing, not having a quality education. And I think these basic things are things that we could easily be financing instead of just bankrolling all these police departments. But Candace, I really want to go ahead and thank you for coming to the show and educating me and our audience about the work that you are doing at the Philly Community Bail Fund. You're always welcome to be back on the LLAG Radio. Before we head out, what are you working on these days, and where can the LLAG community find and support you?
Yeah, so right now, the Philadelphia Community Bail Fund, we are on a hiatus until December from posting bail, just because And the last year alone, like, well, since COVID started, we've bailed out like 400 people and spent like $4 million. And so it's not 4 million overall, but 3 million has been in the last year and a half since COVID started. So like we've been like working like at a fever pitch, and also putting a lot of mutual aid to people who are in need. And so we needed time to rest and like reorient and like working on our staffing and everything. So that's why we're taking a break. But we're coming back in December with our annual youth holiday bailout, where we raise money to bail out people under 18 who are jailed in adult prisons with high bail. So in the past years, we bailed out people held on $30,000 or $50,000, meaning that to get out. And we've been able to bail out like 5 kids a year with bails like that because of the holiday bailout. And so we run that all through mid-November until the new year. And so that will be like the next big thing we do. People can find us on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter at Philly Bailout. And we also, our webpage is phillybailout.org. And so they can keep up with what we're doing. We're really active on Facebook and Twitter. If they just want to know what we're doing, what our comrades are doing, or ways they can be involved. We're hoping in the new year with our hiatus, we'll able to be a place where we can actually activate our volunteers in meaningful ways so that people want to work with us. There be tangible ways for them to get involved in the new year. But again, like we're always raising money. So like the youth holiday bail is a big thing. Like people have been super generous this year. So we've been able to bail out, that 355 people during the pandemic because people have given. Especially after George Floyd's murder, people gave like $2.5 million in that weekend.
Wow.
And so because we're a revolving bail fund, that money we post when a person's case is done, it comes back to us. And so, the money that you give circulates and helps us to free people and support people who we bailed out.
Wow. Well, I am super grateful that you came onto the show and were able to, share your wisdom and share your story. Thanks again, Candace, so much. And thank you, everybody, for watching. Bye, everybody.